Welcome to Evil Done Badly, the worst true crime podcast on the internet. Now, I just found out an interesting stat about podcasts. It's probably totally made up, but I'm going to use it anyway to make a point. And that stat is 64% of podcasts never make it past episode 10. We are currently in episode 11. You know what that means? That puts us in the top 35% of podcasts, at least as far as longevity goes. As far as quality goes, we're probably somewhere in the bottom 0.5 to 1%, but at least we're good at something. We're a shitty podcast that's better at putting out episodes than lots of other shitty podcasts. As far as attracting listeners goes, we're not that great at that. Speaking of listeners, this week's evil person was sent in by one of our 3 regulars. So thanks to Curtis P. for suggesting today's villain, John List. This is a very interesting story, worthy of a fantastic storyteller. But since there's no fantastic storytellers around, how about I just tell you the story instead? You're stuck with me. I'll have to do. And curiously enough, Wikipedia currently has 2 John Lists on there. One's an accountant and one's an economist. The accountant is also a murderer. The economist is not a murderer as far as we know. So we will be covering the murderous accountant. But if time allows, we will take a quick peek into this economist guy and see if he's up to any shady business. But first, grab a beverage and cue the theme music. Before we get started, let's take a moment and hear from this week's sponsor, the Cannibal Cafe. Come on down, put on a bib, and roll up your sleeve as your waiter skillfully removes your flesh and cooks it fresh in front of you and your family. This week's special is earlobe soup. Get both of your ears sliced off for the price of one. We hear it's fantastic. And for the kids, we will remove and fry their snoots free of charge. You knows you can't miss this deal. And don't forget, Thigh Thursday. Come on down, get a great meal, and lose that cellulite all at the same time at the Cannibal Cafe. And don't forget to join the Wide World of Paranormal Investigations group on Facebook for all sorts of quirky topics like conspiracies, cults, and cryptids. That's the place to go. Now, back to the show. John Emil List was born in Michigan in 1925 to very strict religious parents. I have no idea where his middle name, Emil, originates from, but I did notice that it spells lime backwards, which is a totally pointless thing to notice, but I enjoyed noticing it. Either way, his parents were domineering, and he grew up a deeply Lutheran Christian, which is some form of Protestantism, which is some form of religion that got really annoyed with the Catholics and went off and started doing non-Catholic things in the 16th century. So he was pretty devout, and he would use his devoutness to justify his terrible actions later on. John would grow up and join the army for a bit during World War II. Eventually, he would get a master's degree in accounting at the University of Michigan. So he was a smart, religious guy who was lorded over by his mom, and he likes numbers. As you might have guessed, This all adds up to Little John being an aloof, cold, awkward dude who had trouble making friends or keeping jobs. Apparently, he was fired multiple times because of his poor social skills. Despite his lack of personality, and I can totally relate to him on that level, he managed to get married by putting the moves on a woman whose husband had been recently killed in the Korean War. Now, let's face it had to be exceptional circumstances in order for this guy to not die a virgin. He saw his chance to score, and he took it. It didn't hurt his chances that his future wife Helen was an alcoholic, which is also something I can sort of relate to, and she would become increasingly unstable. Him and Helen would squeeze out 3 children while he was an audit supervisor at a paper company in Kalamazoo. Along with getting married, he managed to keep it together long enough to hold on to a couple of decent jobs and eventually got promoted to a vice president position at a bank in Jersey City. He was doing so well, in fact, that he moved his family into a 19-room Victorian mansion with ballroom and chandelier in Westfield, New Jersey in 1965. John seemed to have it all together and things looked fairly normal on the outside. But on November 9th, 1971, John would fall apart. He goes from well-to-do, everyday family man to psycho cunt in no time flat. I think it's safe to say something snapped in his mind and he took extreme measures to deal with it. He went off the deep end. The very deep end. He missed the pool altogether. Holy shit. So, let's get this crazy started. John and his wife Helen got up that morning of November 9th, ate breakfast, and saw the 3 children off to school. John was alone in the house with Helen and his aged mother, Alma. With the children all gone, and a big, almost empty house, you'd think John could have come up with something exciting to do. Instead, he would put a devious plan into action, using his own semi-automatic handgun and another gun that he got from his dad. John would begin to systematically wipe out his entire family. This devout Lutheranian would start by shooting Helen in the back of the head, killing her instantly. He would then make his way upstairs to the attic where his mother lived. He shot her above the left eye, fatally wounding her. When 2 of the 3 children came home, Patricia and Frederick, aged 13 and 16, John simply shot them in the back of the head as well. And now that 4 members of his family are dead, what do you think he did? Well, he went for lunch. He made himself a sandwich and then began the process of meticulously covering up his murderous rampage. After lunch, he made his way to the bank and closed his and his mother's bank accounts. He then drove to the local high school to watch his son's, John Jr., age 15, soccer game. After the game, they drove home and John opened fire and shot Little John in the chest repeatedly. Little John tried to defend himself, but would quickly succumb to his wounds. In the space of a few hours, John List would no longer have a family. John List would also no longer be known as John List. Now, before running off, John pulled the bodies of his family into the ballroom and laid them on sleeping bags. He covered their faces in cloth and left a note for his pastor. He didn't move his mother because she was too heavy to bring downstairs. He cleaned up the crime scenes, removed himself from family photos, and that was to prevent authorities from having anything to use on wanted posters, and he canceled all deliveries to his home address. He left the lights on, attached a cardboard cutout of Michael Jordan to a toy train, and played Christmas music at an obnoxiously high level. That might have been Home Alone. My mistake. But he did leave the radio tuned to a religious station for what was left of his family to listen to. In the note he left for his pastor, he said that he'd seen too much evil in the world, and he had to do it in order to save their souls. After he was caught, he would give a more detailed explanation of his motives for doing what he did. According to List himself, the murders were quite peaceful, and even John Jr. didn't suffer very much. Now, as much as I'm glad they didn't suffer, it doesn't seem like much of a consolation for making them all dead. They could have been alive and not suffering, but in John's mind, in John's fucked up mind, this was for their own good. The bodies of the List family would not be discovered until about a month later. They were a secretive bunch, and it wasn't unusual for them to keep to themselves. John had sent letters to the children's schools and their part-time jobs explaining that they would be out of state for an extended period due to worsening health issues in the family. He had meticulously covered his tracks in order to buy him some time, to put some distance between himself and his dead family. Eventually, though, it occurred to the neighbors that something was not right. Even for a family as reclusive as the Lists, this was weird. One of Patricia's dance instructors was really concerned and went snooping around on their property. The neighbors called the police and sent a couple of officers out to survey the situation. When they confronted the instructor, who was out snooping around, he convinced them that his snooping was purely on the up and up, and something fishy was going on in the List house. Between the three of them, they decided to break in and solve the mystery once and for all. So they broke a window and got smacked in the face by a wretched, yucky, vile stench. The 5 dead bodies in the house had been putrefying for the last 4 weeks, and were not the least bit fresh. The mystery of the missing family had been solved, but where was Big John, and why the fuck did he do this? In John's confession letter to his priest, he went over the reasons that he did what he did, and absolutely none of them justify the murder of his innocent family. Reason number 1 was money problems. He wasn't earning enough to keep his mansion going and feed his family. Allegedly, he had lost his job and was skimming money from his mom's accounts to pay for the mortgage. He admitted that he could have gone on welfare, but he didn't like the idea of his kids growing up in a place where people on welfare live. So, there you go. Reason number 2. His wife was an unstable alcoholic going silly from syphilis. She also didn't feel like going to church anymore, and this did not sit well with Big John. Reason number 3. His daughter had taken an interest in acting. According to John, it was impossible to be an actor and hold on to your Christian values. He figured it was only a matter of time before the devil got his hooks into her, and Hollywood turned her into a skanky whore with a drug problem. He, as far as I know, didn't use these exact words, but he definitely implied it. John was clearly under a lot of pressure, and I get that, but he picked the wrong way to deal with it. There's no excusing this fucker. People are dealing with shit all the time, and most of them don't kill their families. Not only did he feel no remorse for this, he went out of his way to ensure that he didn't get captured and have to atone for these horrendous murders. He would wind up evading capture for 17 years. The day after the murders, John would park his car at JFK Airport. This was just a decoy, though, as he hadn't taken a flight from there, and it kind of threw the authorities off a little bit. He did take a bus into New York City instead. He would make his way to Denver and assume the name Bob Clark. He picked up a job as a fry cook and eventually as a tax guy with H&R Block. He got back into the Lutheran Church. These fuckers are everywhere. And married another widow in 1985. So, as you can tell, he's still a pathetic rebound fuck. Him and his new wife would relocate again to Richmond, Virginia. Now, old Bob here, formerly John, is probably feeling untouchable right about now. He's got a new life under a new name in a new place, and no one has a clue where or who he really is. But he was not forgotten about. The case never went cold, but it did lie pretty dormant for a long time. Being the second most famous murder case in New Jersey history, after the Lindbergh baby, it never really went away, especially since they knew who the perpetrator was. That wasn't any kind of a mystery. But the mysterious part was that John List seemed to have vanished into thin air. Back in the 80s, watching TV was a real thing. If you wanted to get the word out about something, you did it on prime-time television. America's Most Wanted was an incredibly popular show that focused on raising awareness about fugitives from the law in the U.S. The case was initially rejected because it had been lying around for so long. The show did eventually relent and do an 8-minute piece on the List murders. It would be the oldest case they'd ever covered up to that point. The show featured reenactments and dramatizations of the murders. It also featured an artist sculpturing of what List himself probably looked like when he was aged ahead to the present day. Well, forensic artist Frank Bender fucking nailed it. He used photos of John's parents and came up with an incredible likeness to what John, currently known as Bob, would look like in 1989, right down to the type of glasses that they thought he would be wearing. After the segment aired, America's Most Wanted was flooded with calls, and John was identified by his neighbors from Denver. 11 days later, he would be tracked down in Virginia and arrested. He would be extradited back to New Jersey, all the while still claiming to be Bob Clark. It would take months for John to admit what he did, and it was only because there was an ever-growing stack of irrefutable evidence built up against him, which included matching his current fingerprints to his old fingerprints from the Army. He wasn't talking his way out of this one, and in 1990, he would be found guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder and be saddled with 5 life sentences. List was not happy about that and would remain adamant that he shouldn't be held accountable for his crimes because of the severe mental stress he was dealing with at the time. The judge told him to get stuffed and that he was, quote, a man without remorse and without honor, unquote. He slapped him with the stiffest penalty available, which was 5 consecutive life sentences. John did file appeals on a couple of grounds, both of them half-assed. He said he suffered from PTSD from the war and was therefore not responsible, and that his letter to the priest should have been confidential and should not be considered as evidence. Now, PTSD and mental illness is no laughing matter indeed, but he's a total fucktard if he thinks that justifies all the carnage. As for the letter to the priest, come on, John, he's a priest. He doesn't like you. He's giving that to the cops. You're totally fucked. Both appeals were flatly rejected, and John was sent back to jail. Maybe he found Jesus in prison. I hope he did. And I hope Jesus was a big muscle-bound crazy guy with a mustache who bent him over and made him squeal over and over again. This piece of shit was interviewed in 2002, and he said that after the murders, he didn't kill himself because he was afraid he wouldn't go to heaven. Right. Obviously, he didn't kill himself so he could run off and start a new family and live happily ever after somewhere else. I'm sure God's real impressed there, John Bob. John would get to find out what God really thinks of him in 2008 when he would die of complications from pneumonia at the age of 82. John List, you're a cunt, and I hope Satan pours hot lava into all your orifices while you're impaled on a pitchfork. Good riddance, sir. Just let me put this out there. Now, I'd like to say that I sympathize with anyone who is suffering from mental health issues and money problems. They are not always easy to deal with, but no matter how bad they are, murder is never the answer. Mr. List, your family did not deserve that. They had their whole lives ahead of them, and you stole it from them. Then you ran it off and started a new family for yourself. You're a coward and a cunt, and if there's a heaven, there's no place for you there, asshole. This is a terrible story, but at least these atrocities didn't go unpunished. John Emil List? Yeah, fuck that guy. Now, John August List is one hell of an economist. He's known for establishing field experiments as a tool in empirical economic analysis. He's been shortlisted for the Nobel Prize and is ranked as the worldwide #1 economist of the last 20 years. He's written best-selling books and has a list of accomplishments longer than the collected works of Shakespeare and Irvine Welsh combined. But the main thing that sets him apart from the nut job in our story is that he hasn't murdered his family. He's married to a surgeon and has 8 children. He's doing fine, and he seems like a swell guy. And if you are interested in the theoretical and empirical effects of scaling on the microeconomic environment, you can buy his chart-topping book, The Voltage Effect. And there you have it, another episode of the Evil Done Badly podcast in the bag. I hope you enjoyed this terrible discussion of some terrible murders from 1971. Thanks again to Curtis P. for bringing this topic to my attention, and if you would like to suggest future topics, I can be reached on Instagram at evildonebadly or by email at evildonebadly@gmail.com. Check back next time for some more evil done badly. Thanks for listening. Adios.